Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Literary Translation Centre at the London Book Fair. My name's Eloise. I work for BBC Arabic. And over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the issue around translating the news in terms of the Arab Spring online and in print. And to help us with that, we have Neriman Youssef, who is a translator, an author, and a scholar. Neriman is doing a PhD at the University of Manchester in translation history, and is one of the first women to have published a personal account of the 18 days leading up to the revolution, leading up to Mubarak stepping down last year. And that's published in an ebook series by Random House. She's also the translator of The American Granddaughter by In'am Kushershi, which was published by Bloomsbury last year. Nariman, welcome to Literary Translation Centre.
Thank you.
We have Tariq Shaheen, who is a Cairo-born political cartoonist, and he's known in Egypt as the first political cartoon blogger since the mid-2000s. He published every day in the Daily News Egypt a series of cartoons called Al-Khan, and he's published them all together in this book, Rise. Tariq, welcome to Literary Translation Centre.
Thank you.
And we have Marilyn Booth, who is a professor at the University of Edinburgh. Marilyn holds the Iraq Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies. Marilyn has translated an incredible amount of fiction and memoir, and her latest book is by Ilyas Khouri, titled As Though She Were Sleeping, published by Archipelago this year, almost this week. I don't know when exactly, a couple of weeks ago. Now, before we start the discussion, we thought it was important that each one of our panelists took 5 minutes or so to describe to us, to tell us how they have been translators in times of revolution. I think this is a good way of us understanding who they are and what they've done, and to also set the scene for the discussion. So, Neriman, I know you were there right in the thick of it all. Could you tell us how you've been or acted as a translator in times of revolution?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eloise. I'm very happy to be here. I'll start by saying something that most of you know, is that a lot of us just became kind of news reporters almost without choosing to be. Anyone who was in the middle of events as they were unfolding was answering calls from different media and just giving them reports of what was happening. So, and there was definitely an implicit effort of translation in that, both in terms of selection and in terms of formulation. So, what do you actually? You can't tell the story of everything that's happening around you, so you're constantly selecting what to report on, and that I see that selection as translation, as part of the process of translation, and also you're choosing how to translate things linguistically. There are a few things that I want to say related to that about the problematics in of translating the news. In general, and how much do I have? 5 minutes?
It's lovely.
Okay. So I think translation as a tool of newsmaking it was actually at some point it was a tool of newsmaking and activism and in one stroke, and what everyone did, whether reporting about the news or whether trying to keep the world's attention, because it was at some point for many of us on the ground, it became almost a matter of survival to keep the world watching, and that was pinned, as it were, against the fear of total isolation when there were a few days with no internet and no news, very little news coming in or going out, and so transforming the chaos of real events that's involved in that process to world news becomes problematic because it narrows things. So one of the main outcomes of that is that the Egyptian revolution. I mean, of course, we'll probably get to the question of whether we call it revolution or not later in the discussion. I'm sure I saw that in your notes. But the whole process of the Egyptian revolution, which is something that started over a year ago, well, there was an event that brought it to the world stage a year ago, but there were many more smaller events that were leading up to that, and there is a process that's been going on throughout that year and continuing. But the totality of that process, what was kind of reduced in the spectacle of Tahrir Square, which is admittedly a very inspiring spectacle, but it doesn't sum up everything that was happening. I think what happens is that the aim of translation then becomes to narrate neatly delimited stories that fit the multiplicity and messiness and sheer repetitiveness also of reality into something like what Palestinian poet Rafif Ziada called making a massacre fit into sound bites and word limits. Sound bites that succeed in grabbing the attention of readers and viewers, at least for a while, before moving on to something else. When I agreed to write my personal response to or my experience really, which I didn't see it at the time as writing my experience. I saw it as writing one angle of what happened in January and February in Egypt. And I was excited about recording that very shortly after living the events themselves, because we were still all in the throes of the hope of it. And then, as I was writing it, I hesitated for quite some time, because I feared that what I was doing was just was adding to the idea of Tahrir as the revolution. But then at the end, I decided to go ahead and complete it, because it was everything that I could talk about was what I lived, and what I lived through was Tahrir Square. But also, I think what I want to end with is open up this image of Tahrir Square a bit, and because there is a continuous rupture that keeps shifting between how I related to that place and what the word Tahrir conjured up for me before Jan 25th, 2011, and after, and what it conjures up for me now, and what it conjures up in the news, and that keeps shifting and changing. So I just tell you that for those of you who have not been there, it's Tahrir with this jumble of traffic and near suicidal pedestrians, with its mix of small shops and global fast food chains, newspaper stands and street vendors who are spreading their goods on the surrounding pavements, with a permanently abandoned construction site that's been there for years. No one knows what's being constructed there on one side, and a large bureaucratic building on the other, with the Egyptian Museum that keeps being repainted but looking as dusty as ever all the time. Tahrir epitomizes life in Cairo as its most chaotic, I think. And I personally have always had a connection with that place. I went for 15 years of my life, that's counting kindergarten, so you don't think that I spent 15 years in school. I was driven I was driven in the school bus through Tahrir Square on the way to school every morning, like for 15 years every school day. I watched it from the window of the school bus every day for 15 years, and then after that, for 4 years, I walked through it or drove myself through it to go to university, and then for an extra year after that, I changed trains in its underground station to go to work in Heliopolis. So that was Tahrir, the center of Cairo, in my imagination. And in the years that I lived in London, from 2001, Tahrir was always synonymous with the center of Cairo in my mind. Now let me just remember what are the main points I did not want to miss. I don't mean to be quite despairing about the possibility of translation and what can be, or of news making as such. It's not all about reduction. It could be just, it's important to recognize the limits of what we can communicate, but it's the only way we can communicate is by allowing ourselves to be limited. So it's important to continue doing that. But what I want to leave you with is that in the process of reporting on what was happening and in the process of holding the world's attention on Tahrir Square, which was only one site of the revolution that was unfolding throughout the whole country. I mean, Egypt is 1 million square kilometers, I think. The place itself has become a symbol. Its aerial view mainly has become a symbol. And the word has become a shorthand for something that changes from one person to another. And I think maybe that's, what this has achieved at the end is opened up possibilities of interpretation that are as many as the communicators and the receptors' views, the receptors' ways of interpretation. And maybe that's really the best that translation can ever hope to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Nariman. That's great. Tarek, how have you been a translator in times of revolution?
My role would have began before the uprising, because I'd been writing for years before these events. At the time, my writing was considered very candid and very dangerous. Obviously, what a difference a year makes, that if you read the things I've written now compared to what everyone feels courageous enough to write today, it pales in comparison. But in as far as it was edgy at the time, just a few years ago, and most actively there was a daily comic strip that I wrote, and my purpose was to write about society, to try to just write stories that were within a political context, in that a lot of the lives of the people were affected by the large cage that everyone was living in, which is the limitations of the politics and the lack of freedom. But in many cases, they weren't directly at politics. There were a few activist characters, but everyone else was stories about difficulties in marriage, sexual harassment, all those fun topics. Interestingly enough, when the uprising happened, when the telephones lines came back on and the internet came back on, I started getting a lot of people trying to, give us your insight. We've been Googling Egypt, and the cameras are all on Egypt. What do you think? And I don't consider myself to be. I was at Tahrir Square, but I'm certainly not in one of the leading. I wouldn't consider myself a top activist or a top commentator or a top anything. But everyone thought, and the reason for that, a big part of it was, I hope to some degree, because my writing helped put some light on society, but because it was in English. Yeah. And it could have been in English as I chose voluntarily to write, or it could have been that I'd written in Arabic and then it got translated. But that was an important way for people to try to understand what was going on in the psyche of people in the few years leading up to the uprising. And if I may make just a follow-up to Nariman on my observation on the news, I think the media was, its role and its success was misinterpreted, because it got credit for something which I saw was a big failure, which is all the journalists being right there with their cameras and talking to everyone. But if you look at the people they talk to the people who were quite well educated, spoke English. Yeah. Friends of mine. You don't want to learn about Egypt from many of my friends, because as the election results would and many of the problems since would prove, there's a larger society that needs to be addressed, and I think, I don't want to generalize, but most of the coverage was focused on whoever could speak. Exactly. And that's an unfortunate circumstance of the need to speak to someone who can communicate.
And who could speak English.
And who could speak English. And I touched on that in a prologue to my book, just making fun of that very fact. However, where the media would have succeeded, but very little credit is given there, because it's hard to put your finger on, is when the internet and phone lines were off in the very dark days at the start of the uprising. What would be a secondary form of media, which is satellite television, secondary compared to the internet, suddenly became the most technologically advanced way of reporting the news. And then you still had the brave journalists in the square talking to people. And what they would do is they'd be standing to an activist and say, what's going on? The activist, unable to communicate with anyone, would say, we're going to hold a 1 million person march tomorrow. And then Al Jazeera, or whichever big news media would say, it's been reported to us that tomorrow there's going to be a 1 million person march. And then a 1 million person march takes place. And the fine line between, were they reporting it, or were they actually the way in which that activist circumvented the internet block and called for a 1 million person march? That is what I think when later on history will, if there's such a thing as media historians, they will look at that and find that that was the more effective role.
News was actually creating the event, and then the events being, covered by the news. Thank you, Tarek. Marilyn.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. I certainly agree with everything that Nariman and Tarek have said, and I want to focus on something a little bit different. When I think about myself in terms of sort of translating the revolution, I'm also thinking of myself in my role as a teacher. Up in Edinburgh, we've done, as well as other places, quite a lot of public events for students and for whoever wants to show up following. I mean, I've been to Egypt twice since, since it started, and have come back and have tried to convey not so much any kind of narrowly, I suppose, descriptive notion of the revolution in Egypt, but more a sense of the feeling and also of the artistic exuberance. I think that one of the things that's been really important everywhere, not just in Egypt, has been the notion of a political aesthetic and the artistic production that has come out of the revolution and that is part of it. And so for me, translating the news is also about translating those artistic forms, because those are part of the news, those are part of the revolution. They're not just a representation, they are a form of revolution. And so, for instance, I think, whether it's cartoons, which I've used a lot when I've given talks, also the amazing murals, the street art, the graffiti that has been produced in Cairo, and the way, if you look at, there's a very good article on jadaliya.com right now, which shows a series of murals that have been painted on the walls around Mohammed Mahmoud Street, an area around particularly the Ministry of Defense, in a general kind of an area where there were a lot of demonstrations. Sorry?
Ministry of Interior.
Interior, sorry, yeah, of course. Defense, I know where defense is. And these murals are just incredible in the way that they speak back to power and the way they resist this wall building that's going on. So for me, talking about that and thinking about it and sharing it is very much a way to sort of translate the revolution. And I think that also focusing on these artistic forms is a way to subvert any kind of narrow narrative about what is going on. And for instance, one of the things that I've long been interested in and certainly have paid a lot of attention to over the past year is poetry, and specifically colloquial poetry. Now, this is one thing it's very hard to convey in translation, the different, in a sense, political valence of different kinds of Arabic, whether it's the vernacular Arabic, which is, is the spoken Arabic and is not associated with the high tradition, and to convey that to compose colloquial poetry in itself, in a sense, is a political act. And so that's something that I very much try to do as a translator. And of course, one can at the same time then link that in to a very long tradition in Arabic of poetry as declamation, poetry as a public form. So it's both utterly a product of the revolution, but also links back to long traditions of various kinds of Arabic poetry. So I think it is important to remind people that art is news and it is revolution. And it's also, I mean, Tariq was talking about producing these cartoons before the revolution, and it's fascinating. I mean, I think that so much of Arabic literature that's been published over, I would say, the past 50 years is about these revolutions. In other words, the kinds of processes and the kinds of problems and the kinds of issues that people have risen together to try to contest and fight against and protest against are there in so much fiction. Now, obviously, I don't want to reduce fiction to sociology, but I think, you know, that this, of course, is one aspect of literature that's very, very rich and important. So, and it's interesting that some of the new books that have come out this year, post-revolution, actually explicitly refer to that. For instance, a new collection of poetry by Abdurrahman al-Abnudi, who's one of the very famous colloquial poets. And in this collection, about half of it is poetry since the revolution started, and then the rest of it is earlier, and he says in his preface, this is also about the revolution. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind and to think about this in the long term, and to think about how art produces political events. And finally, I would just say also that I think one of our roles needs to be facilitating others' acts of translation. I mean, if you remember seeing on TV or on the internet or wherever, people were already translating in Tahrir. The use of different languages on signs was fascinating because they saw their audience as global, and there was a sense of the need to translate. And I think that one thing that we need to do is to respect and translate local creative ways of thinking about what the revolution means. Thank you.
Now, there are so many different modes and forums for translation and interpretation now. We've got ebooks, we have social media, and we have cartoons. I mean, has the role of the translator changed in all of this? I mean, Tariq, you do cartoons. Why cartoons? What can they show that, you know, an article can't?
Facial expressions and my attempt at humor, whether it works or not. But I think that's... I wish there were more people who are writing, if just speaking to other comic artists or cartoonists, if more people would write in a foreign language, I think that would be very helpful, because I would have loved to work, to have written in Arabic, if for no other reason, even for commercially. I mean, obviously writing in English in an Arabic-speaking society, I mean, yeah. I was taking doing a big gamble, but I felt at the time I had a responsibility, because I spoke English and wrote in English, that I needed to tackle certain stereotypes, you know, offer something that's not in the market, which is stories in Egyptian households about Egyptians, just in English, but not only in English. And in my case, it was also using humor that I thought was more understood say in the English-speaking world. As opposed to trying to translate something which is a more difficult task, translating a song or a poem. Because when you're translating a song or a poem, what you're translating isn't just the thought of the poet, but also you're trying to tell the world how the poet said what he said to he or she said to their audience, in what way. But if you were to go into a virtual world where the reader understands that the characters don't speak English, but the humor is all relevant to the English-speaking world, I think that there's a power there that can transcend whatever language barriers there are. I think I veered off away from the question for a second, but...
No, but it's really interesting. I think the cartoon idea of gathering the information and then transmitting your message it's quite powerful. And in some ways you can almost say something a bit more than you could in an article. You can be a bit more daring because it's humor, because it's an image rather than actual words or something.
Yeah. Just on a final thought, if you allow me,
absolutely.
Because I mentioned writing in English. I'm at a point now when I feel if I still would like to write in English for all the reasons I've listed, just reaching a global audience, which is still very important, as you referenced the signs in the square and everything. But also, I think most recently, post the revolution, I think if I can call it, my work is done in terms of putting it out there, certain stories and certain breaking whatever stereotypes I wanted to break in the writing, and now I'm writing in my native Arabic. I could go back to English, but this is my Arabic writing period now. So.
Okay, the transition from English to Arabic. Nariman, when you were there, right in the square, you were dealing with a lot of information. You were actually kind of being a transmitter of news while you were there. I think in your ebook essay, it said something like, you were standing there, you were talking to your friends outside, they were asking what was happening, you were telling them, but then they were also telling you what they knew. Tell us a little bit more about that and your role there.
I think the incident that you're talking about is when I received a phone call from a friend in Germany telling me that a relative of hers who works in the army, who has a rank in the army, has given them the information that the army planes were about to start shooting on protesters. And that was the day, I don't know if you were there, Tarek, but it was, I think it was the 31st of January when there was a very significant moment when F-16 kind of aircrafts just went really down, like really low, and with their deafening sound and everything.
The military never shot at the time, but
no,
they always kept
didn't.
you wondering.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a moment when we were, okay, what are they doing there? And then I get this phone call telling me, get out of there, they're about to shoot. And I was just...
And that was a German friend?
No, it was an Egyptian friend who lives in Germany.
Oh.
So, somehow it was... And her... she had friends and relatives around the square, and she was just trying to call everyone and warn them. But when you were there, I think that was a moment when just the way that you react to events from outside and from within them is completely different. That was a moment when that became clear to me, and also later in the year, and re-experienced that from the other side. When I was in England, and there was, people that I know were in danger there in the middle of protests, and then there were really shooting at them.
Yeah.
But in that instant, on the 31st of January last year, I just did what everyone else around me was doing. We laughed it off. We really just laughed it off. We kept waving at the planes and singing, and there was the awareness that yes, maybe there is danger to our lives, but what can we do? We're just we were hundreds of thousands on the street. If they're going to shoot us all, then so be it. It'll probably bring their downfall even quicker. I don't know. It was a very specific state of mind that we all lived in at the time.
In terms of all this new ebooks, and we've got social media and we've got cartoons, has the role of the translator, Marilyn, do you think that's changed since all of this has started? I mean, is there more of an urgency perhaps for it?
Well, I think there's a lot of urgency, and I think also along with that, but not just over the past year, but maybe over the past 8, 9, 10 years, Arabic literature and Arabic culture in general has finally, thank goodness, come onto the map. It's come onto the consciousness. There's actually now, in the West, in translation, it's always been there for a lot of reasons in France, I think, but much less so in the UK and certainly in North America and in Germany and so forth. So I think finally it's a really good thing in that there's more buzz about it. On the other hand, that buzz itself can get, I think, a bit skewed. And one thing that I worry about in the new context, in the new climate, is that the sort of political demand or the sociological demand governing what gets chosen for translation becomes even heavier, so that you have publishers saying, I'm actually trying to market a translation. If anybody out there wants a translation to publish, I'm trying to market a translation right now, which I think is a brilliant novel about the rebuilding of Beirut after the Lebanese Civil War. But that's not really what publishers want right now. They want Arab Revolution. You know, they want now. They want what's going on now. And so I think one of our roles is to be both to both facilitate the greater interest and help make that, you know, realize that in more publications and more good translations, but at the same time to try to keep reminding audiences and publishers that there's a lot out there that is not maybe what they're focused on first and foremost, but which is equally relevant, which actually does have a lot to say about what's going on right now, but may not be overtly about that. So I think, you know, I'm very pleased that there's more interest now, but I worry a little bit about the nature of that interest and the way that it gets channeled.
Yeah. In terms of the language revolution, I think this is a really exciting bit. You know, so many new words have come out of the revolution, like, you know, gathering of 1 million people, that's one, a millioniyya, that was just created on the spot. Arab Spring itself is a media term, you know, it's catchy, it's short. I don't know if you use that in Arabic even, or what you would, or whether you would just say revolution and then the country or whatever.
I think I read it first in English. I don't know.
I think it originated in English, yes.
I mean, you don't say Arab Spring in Arabic.
We say it reluctantly.
It's a translation from the English.
It's been translated.
Okay. So you would just say Athawra al-Masriya, the Egyptian Revolution or whatever. Or,
no, I don't think it's a disagreement with it as a term. It's just it seems to have been something.
Yeah.
We say it whilst being aware that it came out of Western media and just. Oh, it's not,
I would just say that some people disagree with it.
I would say I do. I mean, I see it. I don't know. I find it just really a bit Disneyfying, I have to say. So it paints everything in, you know, pictures of flowers and butterflies, and it's all spring. And
definitely.
It also homogenizes, you know, it's, you know, the Arab this and the Arab that rather than looking at, you know, Tunisia and Egypt. And so I have some problems with it myself.
While if you say the Arab revolutions, it's a plural, so it's kind of, I think it's a term that came out of the short succession, obviously, that everything happened, but in terms of, you know, a year later, now that the progress in each different country is a lot different than the next one, I think the term will slowly lose a little relevance. But
I think the worst was Arab Awakening or something. Came up with that.
Spring is a bit similar to that. I mean, they both kind of play into the whole historicity. I can't say the word, but you know, there is a historical framework where, you know, the Arab world is trying to catch up with something. So,
but I think one thing that it's important to keep in mind is, of course, all these words have histories. So when you talk about the Arab Awakening in Arabic, an-Nahda al-Arabiya, that has a very long and very specific and very significant history. And so, or the word thawra, you know, you're referring back to previous revolutions, and so all of these terms have resonances, historical resonances, and that very much frames the way that people think about them now and use them. So.
Yeah. Tarek, I have a question for you about your cartoons. Because you were writing in English and you were using British English and American phrases, or, you know, you could say Western phrases to convey, you know, characters who were speaking in Arabic, in Egyptian. I mean, I wondered if you wanted to talk about that a little bit and the reasons for that.
Thank you. That's fine. One of the characters in my comic strip got raped, and that was a storyline that took a few months, and as I mentioned, a lot of the stories were not directly political, but the reader would try to understand how that fit into the whole politics. But a few months later, I visit the victim of sexual assault, and she appears in the first of 4 panels as still quite broken. Her sister, who's a more primary character, her younger sister, and an activist and a journalist, feminist, tries to comfort her and says, and the victim says, I'm never going to have a normal relationship. I'm still repulsed at the very sight of men. And the sister says to her, just as I helped you as a sister, I'm sure you'll find a man who can understand the ordeal that you've gone through. And then the victim says, do you think I can find an open-minded man? And Nada, the sister, says, think positive. And then the victim says, here in Egypt? And then Nada says, the sister says, think global.
Yeah.
And if you, thank you, think positive and think global are terms that don't have an equivalent in Egypt or the Arab world. It's not that people don't think positive and don't think global, but as a motivational kind of expression, you just don't use them. The reason I would use them there, even though, as I said, the reader who would have been following my strip knows that the two characters are not communicating with each other at the time in English, is because I always thought that was a great way to convey the same problem, which is still a problem of women, in this case a global problem, but certainly relevant in the context of Egypt here, whilst also not giving the reader that kind of gap between, am I reacting to the story and what was said, but am I also trying to understand linguistics, what, you know, in the same way as, again, with translating poetry or a song. Because she would have said something in Egypt, it would have lost the impact, because the reader in English would have tried to took them a while to try to understand, oh, is this supposed to be funny or sad in Egypt? But saying it using terminology used in the English-speaking world, I thought made a bigger impact. So that's how I treated it.
Yeah, yeah. And Nariman, I don't know if you want to talk a little about, you know, the chant that everyone was saying, the people want the fall of the regime. And, you know, when you translate it into English, I mean, is it the same want or the actual... Yeah.
You read Scotinism, I think, yeah, we talked about that briefly, that it's the words you read has so many, has stronger connotations than want in English. It's connected to willpower mainly. So it was a very strong, it was an empowering and invigorating thing to actually say out loud. It meant, it didn't just mean wish for something, you know, it meant really will that to happen in a way.
No, carry on, please.
No, I was just going to say, I'm going to take this opportunity to link that with something else I've been thinking about while we're talking. I mean, it's this problematic of losing the specificities of language and of literary specificities of language, because we're concerned with what counts as news and what doesn't count as news. And it's, you know, it's one thing to do, as Marilyn said, and see the art and literature and as the objects of art and literature as news, as things that are that deserve news attention in themselves, because they're products of something, that's how a process that's happening. And between reading those or looking at those objects as, you know, as just simply sources of information, and I think this has always been a problematic, you know, in consuming you know, Arabic literature or art in the Anglophone world. You know, it's something that's, you know, it's always been like this. I don't know, maybe the positive side is at least now there is a shift. There's definitely a positive shift from the 2000s, when it was all about clash of civilization. So now it's all about the revolutions. But it's important still to ask questions like the one you just did, like what does actually the word mean? You know, just to state to the nuances with the nuances of things.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you look in the dictionary, you would the word want would mean yurid in Arabic. But in terms of how it's actually used, and please correct me, if you say I want something, as the example you gave before we sat down, you said I want an ice cream. You would say nifsi, which nifsi is a lighter variation of crave in colloquial Egyptian Arabic. But whenever you say yurid would actually mean demand. And it's, as you said, it's very subtle, kind of fine line between. They're all correct, but it's important to understand.
But also
the strength of
demand still doesn't carry the positive willpower in it as much. It's still like
You think demand is weaker than you read if you can.
It's not weaker; it's just different. But it's
okay.
that's you know, so when you translate, you always lose something and gain something else.
You read irada. I mean, there's a sense of absolute persistence, determination, will. Yeah, so it's very much a part of it. Yeah.
And in a lot of literature today, when you're translated from Arabic into English, the words are actually written in italics and written phonetically. You know, almost like trying to bring the reader a little bit closer. And I mean, you do that a little bit in some of your books. And I know that Ahdaf Swaif has done a lot of that in her new book as well. She's even used the numbers for some of the letters that can't be pronounced. And I wondered what you thought about that, whether that's kind of exoticizing the
I lost my battle against the numbers in 2000. When they first came out in the internet, the numbers are, there are some letters in Arabic. A simple example, the letter 3 looks like the ayn in ayn. If any of you understand the difference, what would have in better times been this translated as an E with an apostrophe at the beginning is now just a 3 and then E-I-N to say ayn, because the 3 looks like the ayn. I've never subscribed to that. I've never used it once in my writing, and I just wanted to come. Yeah, I've never used it. Very little, even in my personal chat with people. But it's just my own pet peeve. Just needed to bring it out there.
I'd say it's a very complicated matter because Arabic itself is changing, and a lot of writers are now experimenting with different ways of using Arabic. And so there are some writers, for instance, Ahmed Al-Aidi, who actually he will use internet Arabic in his Arabic text. So I think that when you're a translator, I think you do have a responsibility to somehow work with that and make it clear that this is what the author is doing. What I do quite a lot, if it's an Arabic text where I feel there are certain words that I want to leave in Arabic, I'm getting to the point now where I don't italicize them because I don't want to set them off. I just want them to be absolutely part of the text. I never use a glossary. I never use footnotes. I always try to build something into the text to make it clear or almost clear what it is. And I do use it, but I think, in terms of whether it's exoticizing or not, I think that just depends so much on the text. I mean, there's no one answer to that. Sometimes it could be exoticizing, other times it might not be. There are also, of course, instances more and more of, say, the use of English in an Arabic text. And again, I think as a translator, you kind of, because that has meaning. It's not just a stylistic quirk. There's a reason why the author does this. And you need to figure out a way, and not just sort of saying he said in English. You need to figure out a way to convey that. And I've tried various things, and I think, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But I think as long as one tries to respect what the author is doing and takes that, or interprets what the author's doing and at least respects what you think they're doing. I mean, sometimes one doesn't know. I think that's key. That's really important to do.
Super. I think we'll open it to the floor for if there are any questions. Super. I was just thinking, I'd quite like to know who, just do a little survey, who actually uses Twitter as a news source? Just put your hand up. Who uses Facebook as a news source? And who speaks Arabic? Okay, you need to get, publishing and translating. Okay, questions. I think there is a microphone, so please, put your hand up. Introduce yourself if you would like to.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Buchler, and this is a comment as much as a question. I was intrigued by the way you discussed the expression, the Arab Spring, because when that appeared in the headlines, I was immediately reminded of the Prague Spring, which was, and I thought this doesn't all go well, because as we know, the Prague Spring was crushed by invasion of the country by the Soviet army, or army of the Warsaw Pact. So my question really is, I wanted to broaden the context of this and remember history, but also I was wondering whether it has occurred to any of you that this was the connection possibly in the minds of English-speaking journalists.
In my case, yes, I was aware of the parallel.
Yeah.
presumed parallel at the time. But.
Yeah, I was too, and just to put a plug in for the center I run, the Center for the Advanced Study of the Arab World, we're planning a conference to happen in about a year that tries to look comparatively, especially with a focus on the arts, but not only, but between not so much the Prague Spring, but later events in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So, anyway.
Thank you. I'm a news editor and translator myself. Picking up on your point, Tarek, when you mentioned that the media only met with your friends, your English-speaking friends, and hence, as a result, later people were surprised with the election results because they were talking with the wrong or different or the minority of people. I think there was a deliberate choice to censor certain translations, not because it's like a conspiracy theory, but it didn't fit the original narrative that's been running for years. To hear words like Allahu Akbar, for example, God is great, is always coupled with prior to a terrorist act or in a film or documentary, always something negative. All of a sudden you start hearing people calling for democracy with overtly religious rhetoric. It doesn't fit in the receiving end. For the people who are saying it, the English speakers, they know what's going on, but they're too scared to repeat it because they don't want to be demonized, or perhaps the whole revolution would be thought of as something else, and nobody would stand by their side. So they chose not to take part in passing the message through. But it was very clear. It was caught in camera. Nobody was translating it. When you read sometimes AFP stories, France Presse Agence. They make a point of writing it in Arabic, not in Arabic, but writing how it's pronounced in Arabic, and then translating it when it's in a negative context. But when it was in a positive context, people just shied away for it for good or bad reasons. But if you're an Arab observer, you wouldn't have missed it. It was very clear. Thank you.
This was a question or a comment? I agree with the comment, but yeah. I didn't notice all of these examples that you gave, so they're very helpful, but yes, that was generally the impression.
There's something I'd like to add to this, actually. I think I totally agree with you. And I think there was also, it wasn't all the onus of that didn't all fall on the media. I think there was definitely an awareness of, I think maybe there was a bit of self-censorship going on, an awareness on the ground of how things, what would make sense and what would maintain the world's sympathy, because people were scared of losing the world's attention and the world's sympathy. So even in terms of what the demands of the revolutions, like in Egypt, for instance, people were called the demands that appeared in the chants had nothing to do with democracy. The word democracy was not used, but when things were then translated to outside media, we all used the word democracy in giving, in just, commenting on what was happening, and it was just a very unreflected upon, I think, just act of making meaning, making sense to the outside.
If I can just add one thing, I think just to be fair to history, as long as the cameras were in Tahrir Square, this was a secular revolution, even though it was a melting pot of people from all walks of life, and that's how it succeeded, but the collective demand was of a secular nature. Yes. Yeah. Yes, because it has a negative connotation, but it wasn't. No one was standing there saying Islamiyya, Islamiyya. But what would have been helpful, I think, was if enough more cameras, even at the height of the uprising, would have gone to the rural areas, try to understand what people who, even though there were uprisings in every part of Egypt by the time the 18 days were over, I'm not belittling the role of other smaller cities, but just normal people who weren't up in arms, and that would have been helpful to prepare the rest of the world for what would come, because the jubilation, although deserved and a breath of exhale at the end of the 18 days, a lot of the predictions would ultimately prove to be too soon. So.
Also, the fact, using the word Allahu Akbar does not necessarily mean Islamist. It was used in a secular context. People who were calling Madaniya, and Madaniya I think at the time meant both non-military and secular. Even that, I think that's the most accepted word for secular in Arabic. But they have focused it on just meaning civil, non-military. But there was a point when it was used during the protests when it meant both, and there are various examples for that. But what I liked about your comment is that actually they did not preclude the use of religious language, because people would say Allahu Akbar just when they feel that they were in danger and they were out of danger. It's part of how people react to things, and it doesn't mean anything. Anything particularly radical or particularly alienating, but because of it's been always portrayed as alienating in Western media, so that's why it was shied away from.
I mean, we say, "Oh my God," all the time, and that's got not necessarily anything to do with religion. So, yeah. Who has the microphone now, or is there any other questions? Yeah, we have someone at the back there.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a translator, but from Spanish, not Arabic. But slightly related question, also picking up on what Tarek said about the news crews really only interviewing English speakers, and that kind of distorting the story that came through. Well, that seemed to me that it was a lack. In that case, it would have been a lack of the Arabic interpreter there, kind of affected the fact that a distorted version of the story was coming through. And I was wondering whether you had noticed that lots of translators are sort of rising to the challenge now, Arabic translators sort of coming forward to give a voice to the stories, versions of the story which maybe otherwise were excluded, and have translators played a role in kind of shaping and giving a voice to alternative versions of what's happening on the ground?
I think that would be a question for Marilyn. Just the first half of the question, I think, yes, it was partly convenience, and then the other part would be the narrative, largely speaking.
Yeah. I'd say I think that's a really important question, and I mean, I think yes, I think that is important, but there's a lot of work to be done. And whether you're looking on the internet, whether you're on YouTube, whatever you're on, there is just so much. And I mean, just this last time I was in Egypt about a month ago, I mean, I bought, I don't know, 35 or 40 books that had just been published in the last few months, either poetry collections or blogs that were now being printed, and then I could have bought another 35 or 40. It just tons of things coming out, and I think there's so much, and I think the more we can do, the better. But I think there is also a problem of whether we're going to find publishers. I mean, are the narratives that are told in these books that we want, or whatever, this material we want to somehow translate and facilitate and get out, is that something that is actually going to be picked up and published and made available, or can we, websites? I mean, I think that's really the way to go. That, I mean, I've been chatting with some people about trying to start a website to do this, but there are other projects, and again, a website like jadaliya.com, I mean, they do also welcome translations. So I think it's important to start doing that. I mean, just as one example, I'm thinking about, shouldn't do this, but there's an independent journal magazine that's been coming out sort of off and on for a few years called Al-Kitaba Al-Ukhra, The Other Writing. And they've put out what I think is an absolutely marvelous volume of poetry, blogs, essays, art, photographs on the Thawra. And I'm thinking, it would just be great to be able to translate this into English and publish it, because right here is a sort of variegated collection. I mean, from one maybe political perspective, definitely a secular pro-revolution perspective, but it's just a fantastic document and also a fantastic piece of art, both in its components and also in the way the whole thing is put together. So I think to try to do some projects like that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I've got one, and that is, would you guys agree that we have all become translators and transmitters of news and culture?
Well, I think I mean, I don't want to sound too cynical saying this, but I think translation has become kind of the mantra of the 21st century. You know, it's sort of both metaphorically and literally, and there are good reasons for that, because actually we all have to do that in our lives. I mean, in the world we live in and with all the communications. On the other hand, I sometimes frankly think it's a term that gets a little bit overused. And we need to think carefully about what are we doing when we're translating, and what does translation actually mean? And I don't necessarily have it. There's no one answer for that, of course. But I guess so. I'd sort of say a very cautious, wimpy yes and no on that. So.
I mean, I think we're halfway there in large part because of technology. So I think we're at a point where everyone in the world can communicate to each other.
And it's a minority, I guess.
Well, yes, but that'll the computer literacy is I think a problem that in a few years it will be most people can somehow communicate, but it's still we need some more time for everyone to communicate in the same language, whether that same language is just but with the help of translators on both sides, or that we somehow find a way to communicate through music, math, or photos. I mean, it's a very romantic view of how the world can be, but yes.
Okay, I agree with everything that's been said, and I particularly share Marilyn's concerns about overusing the term translation. I mean, I think we do that to a lot of words, really, and they lose their meaning. Yeah, on the one hand, we need to be critical about what we're doing and what counts as translation, and what are the different types of translations. On the other hand, there is something quite positive in the crowdsourcing approach to everything. It's not, this affects literature, it affects translation, it affects news, it affects scholarship, it affects really everything. But it doesn't mean the fact that anyone with internet access can share and can transmit and can translate does not mean that we can now stop asking ourselves questions about what are the selection and limitation criteria that are still governing that. There's always going to be a kind of inclusion and exclusion dynamic going on.
Excellent. Well, if there are no more questions, Nariman Youssef, Tariq Shaheen, Marilyn Booth, thank you all very much for coming.